IntireNet presents the Learning and Development Industry's Thought Leadership Interview Series with your host, yours truly, Mojo Tillett. I have the pleasure today to sit down with my friend Tom King, who is a learning technologist. We've bumped into each other quite a bit at ACE-TD events and such. So you've worked with a plethora of different clients, such as Boeing and Adobe and Macromedia.
Even Authorware Inc. back in the day.
Back in the day. Well, we won't talk about back in the day too much today. We're going to talk a little bit about what's going on today and the future. I loved our conversation earlier about kind of that concept of what e-learning really is, and how we need to broaden what we think of e-learning.
Yeah, just teasing that out a little bit and unpacking it. I think, we talk a lot about blended learning, and it's pretty obvious that there's sort of instructor-led training and these self-paced materials, but even with e-learning, depending upon your particular tool in your organization, when someone says we need more e-learning, people immediately assume, how much Flash or how much Captivate or whatever the tool is do you need. But I think it's important to think about e-learning itself as a blended learning tool and a blended learning strategy, and that you have things from performance support, wikis, job aids, digital job aids, e-books, classic self-paced training, electronic assessments, and that when you're thinking about e-learning, it itself is a whole continuum, and there's a wide spectrum of things on that. Not necessarily one solution, and it's really finding the right tool for the job and the right tool for the context.
Yeah, totally. I agree with you there. I think we have a problem thinking in terms of learning as a single event anyways. I think it'll help us a lot if we can kind of broaden our idea on what learning should be beyond that single event. So we talked about the technology of kind of the e-books and what kind of is happening in that space. I know you've done a lot of stuff in that space and kind of have a passion around that. Tell me a little bit about what you've been doing.
Well, I've been working on a couple things. So one kind of phrase I've been using a lot is that when we think about e-books, we're kind of implying that the model hasn't emerged yet just by the term e-book. And it's really coming from a digital publishing and a digital pre-press perspective, and just saying what we used to do to sort of feed it to the machine that made the paper, now let's feed it to the machine that makes pixels and display it. And along those lines, we're calling it e-book like they used to call a car a horseless carriage, or a train an iron horse. And obviously we know a train is a lot different than a sort of metallurgical version of a horse, and a car and gas stations and the infrastructure, all that stuff that evolved is a lot different than a carriage without a horse. So I think when we look at e-books, we need to start thinking as instructional designers above and beyond just turning what was ink and paper into a PDF or into a specific format, but start thinking about the adaptation and the evolution of that. I think a great example of that is a friend of mine who worked at a sort of airline and package company said, Tom, I spend a lot of my time going upstream to policy and procedure manuals, taking a bunch of material. I take that material, I copy it, I put it into a PowerPoint. Once it's in PowerPoint, I do some instructional design and some wrapping around it, but I'm really just dressing up the core stuff that comes from that policy. Then I go in and I add some interactions and some questions to assess whether you understand the policy. Then I push it through Flash in order to get it to the LMS to have a compliance check that you understand that policy and procedure. Well, now I've lost all the version control goodness of the book upstream, and that's a lot of work. And then when the policy and the procedure changes, it's sort of like the back of the shampoo bottle, rinse, lather, repeat. I got to go all the way back to the policy manual and start all over again. What if I could have a book that's like a book on steroids, a book with real rich instructional design and interactivity that thinks sort of outside of the rhetorical question or go answer on a piece of paper and come back to me, but it has some of that interactivity, and now I could get all the book version control and the book tools upstream and end up with something where I put the interaction right in the book, and that maybe reports to an LMS or stores for a sync or something like that, so I get all the compliance and regulatory tracking I want, plus the rich instructional design, plus the goodness of book version control and configuration management, without all the extra work.
Yeah, well, a little bit utopian, but I like the concept. I think that oftentimes we stumble on that process, right? Whether it is an e-learning or whether it's something like an e-book, that same thing has bit us. We would take that same content, do the exact same model to an e-learning, really, and break that cycle as well. So how do we kind of work on our processes to kind of make that a little bit more smooth, do you think?
I think part of it is changing the way we think. One of the traditional challenges for e-learning, and one of the reasons we go back to our favorite tool, is just the whole process of estimating and budgeting and student footprint time. I've heard of organizations where they have some regulatory oversight on a piece of training, and they switch over something that was stand-up instruction or some other format, maybe a static video, into some self-paced learning, and it gets maybe 15-20% smaller, but the regulatory oversight says thou shalt take 1 hour for this.
Right.
So part of it is really looking at the goals and the requirements, and also looking at the media, and can we get better estimating around it. One of the things I find fascinating about the book format is I would estimate you could get a 20% to a 1/3 reduction in production time for a lot of content. That is, we have this term, it's interesting in the novel world, a page turner is a great thing.
Mm-hmm.
In the e-learning world, it's a horrible thing. We're playing sort of Where's Waldo with the next to continue button, and we move it around on these sort of single click interactions that aren't very engaging. Well, guess what? A book has this kind of very primitive paging metaphor.
Right.
And that's exactly what it's suited to. So if you have a lot of content where you have these sort of single click interactions, maybe it's the instructional design choice of forcing it into something that's sort of time-based or kind of the, quote, richer, more simulation-based e-learning. And I think part of that equation is going back and saying, when we're looking at this, if we have a part that's very linear, very structured, something you're going to come back to as a reference, let's put that into a book. And that will give me more time as a simulation developer or instructional designer to have that kind of assimilation activity where I'm really using higher order thinking skills. It's not recognition and recall or information transfer, it's information application. And you can build a lot richer simulation if you kind of lean down kind of the classic e-learning and take advantage of a lot of the power of the new e-books.
Interesting. Yeah, you're kind of embracing what that content is. Now, how do you balance the interactivity with that linear content? How do you find that right balance, do you think?
I think part of the balancing of the interactivity with the linear content is recognizing and embracing that the book is a linear form, but within that you can have richer interactions. So, in the various tools from the various vendors, they have kind of these discovery or explore interactions, whether it's, Inkling or an EPUB format or any of these. You can do things where you have virtual tours, which aren't necessarily linear in the middle of it. And you can base kind of your overall footprint on the fact that it's a 80% linear media, but realize that you will have some things where it's sort of self-diagnostic enrichment and remediation. If you want to go in deeper into the tour, you can spend more time on that interactive tour and exploring. If you've got it, you can kind of move on through the text-based side.
Nice. I totally agree. Taking it a little bit different direction. Oftentimes, I think we kind of get too hung up on the particular technology. So how do you move forward embracing technology without getting too stuck on one particular piece of technology or tool or whatever? You have any ideas around that?
It's interesting. If you ask anybody to talk about a corporate trainer or a classroom teacher that really motivate them, very rarely do they say, I remember the overhead projector they used. Or, the version of PowerPoint they had is really what made me feel passionate about that. So I think a lot of it is in the instructional design, which is really looking at what is the media, what is the compelling thing. But also, I think one thing we lose sight of is what is the purpose. So if the learner feels like there's a purpose and an application for this, and I can get better at it, you can really make it much more compelling. It goes back to, there's a guy who did a lot of research on being in the state of the zone or being in the flow, Csikszentmihalyi. And if you look at that, the real challenge is there's sort of this vertical line, and things that are kind of over in this half are way too hard, and down here are way too easy. And to stay in the flow, you have to kind of move in this oscillating manner across this mastery where it's enough of a challenge that I don't feel like it's jumped up over here and it's so frustrating I want to bail out, but it's interesting enough that it hasn't become boring and I've totally mastered it and I'm not interested anymore. And a lot of games do that very well.
Yeah, I was thinking games when you said that, and we have a tendency to kind of be willing to put that time in for mastery in a game. That's another thing. It's engaging enough, it's pulling us along, and we don't even really feel the learning happening. We're having so much fun. So I think that's a good analogy.
I think the thing to realize is, we may be working on compliance training, but we're not working on complacent training. So if you can tie in something motivating that, there really is a reason for this safety training or this concern about something that could potentially create litigation, and say that you can actually be a better employee, a better performer by understanding the impacts of safety or avoiding litigation or whatever it is. Once you give it purpose, that giving it meaning also helps kind of make it more relevant and more challenging than just, I have to find the right arrow and get through this.
I think that's a very important point. I've always kind of thought about that. There's that 10% of the organization you don't need to motivate. They are self-driven. They are career oriented. They know what they need to do to move their career forward. And then there's, I'm just guessing on the numbers, but then there's the rest of us that need, this is why it's important to my job. This is why it's going to help me in the long run in my career to increase my performance and so on and so forth. I think leaving that why out is one of the things that we do a lot. And I think it's good that you mentioned that.
Yeah, I think, two key things for me in instructional design have been sort of assumptions and anticipation. And I think sometimes we assume too much that they're going to understand that there's a reason for this or that they are motivated, and we fail to anticipate that a certain number of them will appreciate the motivation or appreciate understanding the purpose, and we can add a little bit of that and start thinking about this from the perspective of the audience and anticipate their motivation, their interest, their desire to get through it quickly, their desire to feel like they've achieved some mastery and it was meaningful, and kind of add that in. I feel really disappointed when you run into an instructional designer who's created training that they would hate to take.
Yeah, and we're our worst critics too. I find myself not engaged quite a bit in some of the training that I take, so I think that's really important. Well, I really appreciate you sitting down and talking to me today.
Thanks.
And I'm looking forward to hearing some more stories about some of the cool stuff you do.
Yeah, we had a whole great series of conversations, so maybe there'll be more to come in other formats.
Absolutely.